but that's not going to work. You know, you guys look spectacular, but you need to look around at all this love. All that support. You know, at this very moment, as we are each enjoying this fabulous venue and this fabulous day, there lives in a different place a young girl. That young girl is black. No. Maybe she's brown. Perhaps she's Asian. She might even be white. She might even be a he. And that boy, that girl, that child might be living in a small strip of land in the Midwest, or she could be living in a trailer park. She might even be growing up in housing projects in a large urban area. Her community, that community has all the usual amenities: high unemployment, high underemployment, a thriving illegal drug market, failing schools. And you know, if each of us had to bet on what kind of success that little girl would have in her life, let's say she's able to escape addiction. Let's assume that she or he is able to avoid incarceration. And let's assume that that child somehow manages not to end up having babies alone and necessarily relying on federal or state welfare agencies. If she's able to escape all of those horribles, many of us would assume that that is the best success that that little girl can expect to achieve in life. No babies, no dope, no jail, that's success. Now, I know and appreciate that there are children that are living in impoverished communities every day whose mere effort to survive is a day-to-day challenge. I get that. When we hear and read about a toddler who is shot to death on his way to the grocery store with his mother in his stroller, we're reminded that there are children in some communities for whom we can't guarantee their physical safety. I get that. I understand that if you can avoid welfare and homelessness and drug addiction and incarceration and just stay alive, I understand that for some people that is success. However, for that little girl growing up in that trailer park or in that housing project, I want us to empower her to do more than simply survive. I want us to empower her to dream. And I want us to convince her that if she does commit her head and her heart and her soul, she can realize that dream. I promise you there are little boys and little girls out there who are dreaming, and they do want to believe. And if we extend our hands and our hearts, we can help those little girls and little boys achieve their dreams. That is my convoluted way of advising you or reminding you that you have selected as your commencement speaker that skinny little knock-kneed black girl who grew up on welfare and was raised by a single mother of 4 in the housing projects of the South Bronx. So, how did I get here? And how is it that that little girl is addressing the latest class of graduates from the most phenomenal law school on the planet. And how do I get here, having become the first woman of color or otherwise to lead a sports union in the United States of America? And by the way, Opie, I am the executive director, not the general counsel. Get it right. Well, we know why I'm here, because you selected me. But that second question, how did I become the executive director of the NBPA? Well, seriously? And you're gonna think I'm kidding, but I'm being honest with you. How did I become the NBPA executive director? It was my destiny. No, it was my destiny. You see, the number of similarities in the paths of the lives of the players that I represent, they're just like mine. And I'm so convinced that those similarities suggested that my getting this job was almost preordained. So how did it happen? Okay, well, let me tell you a little bit about how I got here, and I'll start by admitting that I had a lot of help from a lot of people throughout my life, a lot of it. That said, all that I am and all that I will ever be in my life, I owe first and foremost to one person, my mother. And that fact is the first piece of evidence that I really was preordained for this job. Let me share with you what I did last Sunday. Last Sunday, I spent most of the day doing what I've been having to do for the last few weeks for the playoffs, watch playoff games. And so I did that last Sunday. But as I was watching those games, I was also monitoring social media to see what my players were up to. Now, you will recall that last Sunday was Mother's Day. And not surprisingly, much of the content on social media related to Mother's Day. And you saw the kind of posts that you would expect. I love you, Mom. Mom, you're the greatest, that stuff. But one of the things that I was struck by when I was examining the posts from some of my players is that there was some of that I love you, Mom stuff. But many of the posts read like this: Mom, you saved my life. Mom, you sacrificed all for me. You protected me. You believed in me. Now, I'm not here to suggest that most NBA players were raised by single mothers. In fact, that's not true. Most of the players do come from two-family homes, middle-class backgrounds. However, the players that I came to know when I began to fall in love with basketball were players that had the same background that I did. And I noticed that of those players who, like me, grew up in poverty, almost without exception, they each had some adult in their lives that had lifted them up. An auntie, an older brother, an uncle, sometimes a father, but most of the time, it was like me, a mother. A mother who refused to surrender the fate of her children to the streets. A mother who cut a deal with us. She said, I will give all of me to feed you, to protect you, to shelter you, if you simply promise not to surrender. I will fight for you if you fight for you. Those were the kinds of posts I was reading last Sunday from my players. And those are the kinds of comments and stories that resonated with me for years about these guys. That much we had in common. But there was more. As I was growing up in the projects of the South Bronx, the soundtrack of my childhood was the sound of bouncing basketballs. Literally. The courts were located not far from the building that I was growing up in, and you would see guys, and back then it was always guys, you would see guys out on the courts all morning and seemingly all night. The only time they would not be playing was if for some reason there were no lights on the courts and they couldn't see the rim. These guys would play 12 months a year, and they would barely pause to shovel the snow off the courts. But there was always this small core of guys that you'd see out on the courts every day. I swear to God, they lived out there. And I know they loved the game, but what you could see, what I could see with these guys, is that they believed that every bounce of that ball was sending them further along a journey to a different place. Their intensity was inspiring to me. For me, those guys on those courts, for me, they were the original dreamers. And so, when I tagged along with my mother, when she went to enjoy her favorite free pastime, which was watching trials at a nearby court building, and when I, during those trips, fell in love with the concept of becoming a lawyer, I took my lead from those kids on the court. I dared dream and believe that I too was going to become a lawyer. And then there was Jimmy. Jimmy, and this is not his true name, Jimmy was a young guy that lived in the projects directly across the street from the projects I was growing up in. And Jimmy was the one kid in my generation that the community pretty much agreed probably really did have a shot at the NBA. Jimmy's experience taught me that people looking for star players actually start looking for them at the junior high school age, middle school. You see, they have these powerhouse high school programs, and if you're good enough, they'll recruit you to play. Well, Jimmy was good enough, and he was in fact being scouted by a number of high schools to come outside of New York City and play. Now, I didn't know Jimmy very well, but I was aware of all the conversation surrounding his choice. Most people were very enthusiastic about it, but there was a lot of conversation that was filled with fear. Fear that if he did leave, he might not succeed. You see, because if Jimmy made that move, he'd be making that move all by his 14-year-old self, alone. Coincidentally, I had a similar dilemma going on in my life at that same time. You see, my no-nonsense mother had decided that even though there were one or two perfectly good public high schools for me to attend that would probably land me a spot in college, my mother decided that the better idea was for me to attend a boarding school in upstate New York. And because of a program that was placing disadvantaged students into private schools, I had that option. That was the first time in my life that I had to choose between safety and the road less traveled. You know, one of my greatest life lessons has been to resist the temptation to settle, to silence this voice in my head that constantly tells me to stay the course, don't risk failure, embrace your vulnerabilities. They will lead you through those troubled waters. I could have stayed and gone to public school and probably had gotten into a decent college. Shucks, I could have gone to school in New York, gotten a junior college degree, and probably would have been considered a huge success compared to most of my peers. When I was a public defender, I loved being a public defender. But when I, at some point, decided that I wanted to start my own law practice, I guess I could have said, no, leave well enough alone, stay put. And when later still, I found myself intrigued by the concept of litigating complex commercial cases outside of Washington, D.C. and all over the country, I could have listened to those naysayers who said to me, oh, come on, Michele, No decent law firm is going to take seriously a former public defender as a litigator. I could have listened to them. And when the position of executive director of the NBPA became available, I could have embraced that mindset that said, never a woman, and killed my own candidacy. I could have done that. I could have done all of those things, but I didn't. I later learned that Jimmy had to come back to the Bronx because there was a death in the family to finish high school, but he did make that move. He left. I ended up going to that boarding school in upstate New York. And while he was the last person drafted that year, Jimmy actually was drafted into the NBA. And I'm told that during that 10 plus years of playing professional basketball, he actually spent a year playing for your Golden State Warriors. Lesson learned? Fear the walking dead? No. Fear the status quo. Don't be so satisfied with the good that you deny yourself the ability to be great. Yeah, Jimmy, you know, after all these years, I owe you one. And then finally, one final parallel I've noticed between the players I represent in my own life. And it's their ferocity in refusing to be judged. You know, I've heard them tell stories about how as they were making their way into the league, they were told, you're not tall enough, you're not fast enough, you're too thin, you're too fat. They tell me stories about people who expressed opinions about their never ever being able to make it into the league and how they had to fight their way in. And I can appreciate that because I've had to fight. I've had a lot of battles. And it's not only because of the isms. You know what I mean by isms. You know, that sexism and that racism. I've had to fight those isms for a long time. As recently as when I got this job, I had a phone call with a lawyer that wanted to work for my soon-to-be newly constructed legal department. And during the conversation with me, this chap suggested to me that if I wanted to have any credibility in the New York sports market, that I needed to hire someone like him, a white male Jew, to help provide credibility and to guide me through those waters. That's what he said. Well, I said to him, do send me your resume and make sure you include all your contact information, including where you live. And that's all I have to say about that. I've had to fight isms, but it's not only the isms. People will attempt to tell you what you're worth. People will attempt to judge you and tell you what you're worth. And for my white young brothers in the audience, hold on now. Don't think you're going to avoid being belittled. Don't think you're going to avoid having your judgment called into question. Don't think for one second that you're not going to be burdened with work that insults your time and assumes that you only need an hour and a half to sleep. And if you think I'm lying, wait till you get to that fancy law firm that you're so proud of that hired you. People will judge you and attempt to tell you what your value is. Don't allow them. You declare your value. And don't ever submit. You know, my now best friend, Alan Iverson, who was recent, I loved me some Allen Iverson. When Allen Iverson was recently, well, the announcement was recent that he would be admitted to the Basketball Hall of Fame, he said something which resonated with me along the lines we just discussed. He said, "I love who my mama made me, so why the hell should I be worried about those who don't?" Now that's philosophy. But guys, at the end of the day, none of this matters. None of this matters if you haven't touched somebody. No matter how successful you are, none of it will matter if you haven't transformed somebody, or at least tried to. The degree that you're about to receive is going to confer upon you the power to transform. Believe me when I say that. I'm reminded of that when I still receive letters from men I represented as public defenders who enclose photographs of their children graduating from college, children who never had to spend a single second visiting their daddy in a penitentiary. I was reminded of that just a few days ago by the owners of a small black tech company, a company that had its contract ripped away from it by its general contractor and replaced with a majority-owned tech company. I'm reminded of that when I realize that today that company continues to exist and enjoys revenues in the tens of millions of dollars a year. And I'm reminded of that when I have the good fortune of having one of my players give me a hug or give me a call and thank me and my staff for helping to transform what was a mom and pop shop into a strong union that stands toe to toe to toe with the league. You have the power to transform. I indulge you, I beg you to use it. Now, I had hoped that I would be able to convince the most popular player in our league to join me today. I tried, but his coach and his wife had different plans for him. But I did do the next best thing. I brought to you some words that he spoke when he received his second award for Most Valuable Player. Woo. Which I think you might find useful. He said, "No matter how inadequate critics say you are, whatever drives you inside, wherever you find that will to keep going, it's not about being complacent. It's always trying to get better, no matter how hard the mission might be. Find out what motivates you and hold on to that every single day." My final ask is that if she's here, would you do me a favor? Would you hug your mother? Hug your daddy too. Hug all of your brothers and sisters. Congratulations and welcome to the profession.